First time we're broadcasting live on the web, and hopefully this allows these excellent panel discussions to be heard by a larger audience. We have many of our affiliates. Some of them are seeing this in groups and rooms. We have people from Lutheran Medical Center, Richmond University Medical Center at Staten Island, St. John's Riverside and Yonkers, Good Samaritan in Suffern, Englewood Hospital, Elmhurst Queens Center, St. Luke's Cornwall, Good Samaritan, West Islip, Atlantic Health, St. Joseph Regional Medical Center, New Jersey, the Bronx VA, Jersey Center Medical Center, and Mount Sinai of Queens. And then hopefully on the CC Live cases, which Dr. Sharma has really promoted as an excellent site, both for his live cardiac cath cases as well as for the vascular cases that PK does. We're joining that website to have our program, CC Live Cases. It should be self-explanatory. If there are questions from our web audience, you can send them in, and I'll hand them to Dr. Fuster at the end of the meeting. We've been toggling back and forth both by today's program as well as the list of speakers for the future. In March, Kim Eagle. In April 22nd, Rick Nishimura. May 20th, David Pinsky. And June 17th, Mark Josephson. We have really an excellent panel, and without really further ado, we always start this with our fellow giving a brief overview of the situation of the topic, and this is plaque regression. And one of the things that Jonathan has been able to do is really go from literally bench to bedside. So Jonathan is going to take a few minutes. Jonathan? It's going to take a few minutes. Go ahead, John. So he has one slide. If we can look at that for a few minutes.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Controversies, February 11, 2013, with distinguished guest Dr. Mark Talman, moderated by Dr. Valentin Fuster. Today we are gathered to discuss a very important topic in cardiovascular medicine, atherosclerosis regression. Before I get started, let me just define the term because I think it's crucial. Regression is not simply about shrinkage of the plaque, but rather the change in quality, making it more stable, getting rid of the inflammatory mediators, for example, the macrophage or the B cell or the T cell, and increasing stability via collagen deposition, for example, by smooth muscle cells. Why is this topic important? Well, I don't have to tell this crowd that coronary artery disease is a leading killer, with atherosclerosis being a leading cause. The reality is that studies have shown, for example, by McGill and McMahon, that lesions begin through infancy, and hence the public will have a heavy plaque burden. Even though we've made fantastic strides in terms of inhibiting progression, for example, with statins, or even promoting regression that we'll talk about later, the reality is the patients continue getting MIs even on maximal medical therapy. So the issue is, if we can figure out how to promote plaque regression, we will be able to certainly decrease the plaque burden. Now, is this concept new? Am I the first one to bring this to the table? Well, let's take a little bit of, go back in time, and we find that already in 1920, we started to find the first early reports in animal models that indeed you can heal a plaque. And this was in rabbits, and subsequent studies in the squirrel monkeys, as well as the swine, ultimately showed that you can remove lipid in the plaque. The lipid deposition will diminish over a period of time, for example, when they were switched from high-fat diet to a low-fat diet, and they identified stability factors like increased collagen deposition. So this is crucial because already back in the 1920s all the way up to the 1970s, and now the idea that you can get rid of so-called permanent parts of the plaque became more well appreciated. Now, of course, those were descriptive studies, and if you really want to start figuring out the mechanisms, you're going to need an animal model. The mouse is ideal because it allows one to breed them rather quickly furthermore allowing one to sort of knock in or knock out their gene of interest. And indeed, a revolution occurred in cardiovascular medicine with the identification of the ApoE knockout as well as the LDL receptor knockout animal. Keep in mind that mice actually, their lipoprotein profile is fairly anti-atherogenic, that is to say most of the cholesterol is on the HDL particle, hence they had to sort of figure out a way to tip the balance and promote lesions. And if you feed those animals the ApoE knockout or the LDL receptor knockout animal a high-fat diet, indeed you promote plaque progression. Now this was great because all kinds of genes were identified as playing a crucial role, and in fact Dr. Talman gave a fantastic talk today on MCP1 and its chemokine receptor CCR2, both implicated in plaque progression. And if you look at the left side of the plaque, you could see, of this image, excuse me, that's projected, you can start seeing how the LDL ultimately will get phagocytosed by monocyte-derived cells, and these cells becoming foam cells. And that ultimately, in a simplistic view, is plaque progression. Of course, the idea was that if we're going to identify factors in regression, we're going to need to figure out a model. And indeed, to make a long story short, we identified a model and reported in 2001 that that's possible. And we identified a specific pathway of migration. That is to say that we can promote plaque regression by promoting efflux out of the plaque that seems to be dependent on a chemokine receptor 7. This was actually very important because we validated a number of models, and hence it wasn't model specific. Now, all this data basically says that the plaque is not static, it's quite dynamic. And that's very important because when we start thinking about this in the clinical arena, we have to think about imaging modalities when we're imaging plaque. And we know that angiography, for example, will miss a lot because you're only looking at the lumen, and we know the concept of positive remodeling. Imaging modalities like optical coherence tomography has advanced imaging because instead of just having IVUS, for example, that looks at just the anatomy that the plaque is there, you can now look at plaque components, i.e. the macrophage or the fibrous cap, things that we know play a crucial role in the vulnerable plaque. Newer technologies like near-infrared spectroscopy, looking at the lipid core or the lipid plaque burden, has also been very important. But those are fairly invasive. We're lucky to have Dr. Fayyad here today, who's a leader in non-invasive modalities, and MRI is certainly a non-invasive modality that has been shown to be able to address the plaque, both in the progressive and the regressive phases. The important point to keep in mind is that how does this translate to the clinical arena? Well, we know that we've had a number of clinical trials, both the reversal and the asteroid trial, that implicated statins in promoting regression. They didn't really provide a mechanism, but it certainly proved that indeed the atheroma volume can decrease. We believe that it may be linked to plaque macrophage migration out of the plaque through our chemokine receptor. But there have been studies also linking HDL and regression, HDL and progression. HDL is a very hot topic these days because recent studies showed that while there is a causal link between LDL and myocardial infarction, there was, using mathematical modeling, they were not able to show that high HDL necessarily protects one. Nonetheless, there have been a number of HDL infusion studies that, although not statistically significant, suggested atheroma volume decrease. However, the aim high and, for example, the failure of CETP inhibitors, for example, with Illuminate, have raised questions. So it's certainly a very, very hot topic. So what's on the horizon? Well, just by looking at this slide, one can see that atherosclerosis regression is a coordinated set of events. It is not plaque progression in reverse. In other words, it's not sort of just rewinding the process. There are a number of important ingredients that characterize plaque regression that are completely different, and most recently we identified, using a microarray approach, that a fair amount of motility genes seem to be differentially regulated in regression. So I believe that we have exciting times in cardiovascular medicine today, certainly in the regression field. Stay tuned for a lot of studies further adding to the HDL controversy, and of course biomarkers targeting the plaque, targeting the macrophage, looking at the factors that really decide which plaque is more likely to rupture, I think will allow us to gain better insight in this fascinating process. Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to a lively discussion.
Thank you, Jonathan. You have done a lot of work and you are going to be tested in a few minutes. I must say it's wonderful the way you present it, and you have written this, but we have a lot to discuss. But before we start, let me introduce today our visiting professor, a good friend, Dr. Mark Talman. Most of the things he did in life were good, some were questionable, but I will go over slowly. Right thing, he was born in New York. And then he was actually went to medical school at NYU. And then he went to Boston, where was at the Brigham as an intern, a resident, a fellow in cardiology, a research fellow in cardiology, and then with 2 years of research at the Children's Hospital. Actually, few more. This is where he really moved into basic science. And then he decided to come to Mount Sinai in New York. This was right too. He became assistant professor, associate professor, Arthur Fishmer professor of medicine, and full professor of physiology and biophysics. And this was in about between 1998 and 2003. Now, then he had a number of commitments in New York. He did a great job on a number of positions. He was director of molecular and cellular cardiology. He was director of the fellowship cardiovascular diseases here, and he was the director of the MD and PhD program at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. And then what happened? What happened with my friend Mark Talman? What happened with my friend Mark Talman, he left. And he went to Rochester, New York, where he was recruited with a professorship, the Paul Yu Professor of Medicine at the University of Rochester in New York. And then there he had so many jobs. He started to be the director of the Center for Cellular and Molecular Cardiology, director of Cardiovascular Research Institute, chief of cardiology, physician-in-chief of a Strong Memorial Hospital, University of Rochester, chairman of the Department of Medicine, acting CEO of the Medical Center, and now he's dean of the School of Medicine and Dentistry at the university and vice president for health sciences. To summarize, he's a big shot. All right. Then we have to move on into aspects that really we feel all proud of Mark. With American Heart Association, he became the editor-in-chief of the Arteriosclerosis, Thrombosis, and Vascular Biology Journal. He was the chairman of the research committee, and he was involved with many other committees of the American Heart. He was the chairman of the scientific board of the Sarnoff Endowment for Cardiovascular Sciences. He had a large number of awards, which I don't have much time to mention, but certainly since 2008, he has been consistently funded by the National Institute of Health. The most recent grants, smooth muscle cell tissue factor and cardiovascular disease, venous thrombosis in cancer in outpatients. Now, when you go over his curriculum, perhaps the most interesting part is he has close to 100 publications, but all of a very high quality. He has been very instrumental in the understanding of the coagulation system, particularly closer to the tissue factor, and he has been very involved on the understanding of platelet activation. And as I mentioned, he has more than 100 publications, which are of the highest quality. And I like to define actually Mark like a person that I have known for many years, is high quality, and he really is a very solid citizen. Thank you very much, Mark, for visiting us again. And let me give you a plaque. I think it has changed slightly since you were here. I'm not sure they check if it is more or less than before, but here we have our faculty. We express the appreciation to you, and You know, this is under the sponsorship of Anandi Sharma, Sharma's father, and Simon Duck, and you gave the memorial lecture this morning. So it's wonderful to see you again. He's an opera expert, but let's leave this aside. Now I'm going to call all these experts on plaque regression. Zahi Fayyad, Pedro Moreno, Jagat Narula, certainly you, Jonathan, and Robert Rosenson. Yeah, thank you. Excellent. This is a very interesting and challenging subject. And it's a subject that you can go into basic science and nobody will understand what we are talking about because it's very complex. The atherosclerotic process is extremely complex. When we talk about cytokines, there are at least 150. So just to give you a sense how difficult it is to get into a particular molecule in trying to make the disease to regress. And here, the audience, most of the people are clinicians, so we have to be very down to earth and discuss what we are talking about. And what I did first is to summarize in my own way the paper nicely presented by Jonathan in terms of 5 statements that he made, which I think puts into the context what we are going to discuss. The first statement is he goes into regression and stabilization of atherosclerosis in humans has gone from just a dream to one that is achievable. I suspect that what is achievable, I'm not sure it's regression or stabilization, but what is achievable is the decrease in the cardiovascular events. Because as you are going to see in a minute, regression is very, very little, regardless of what therapeutic instrument you actually use. So this is his first statement. And then he has actually 8 pages which relate to animal models. And I think animal models certainly is the start of many of the great achievements today, but frankly are animal models. And the animal models, as far as I can tell, in terms of atherosclerotic disease, there are very few that are pertinent to human disease. And maybe the rabbit on the inflammation, and maybe the pig. But out of those 2 animals, I have at least personal skepticism in dealing with the atherosclerotic process as such. Now, the third statement is regression. All the studies done on regression with imaging technology have not decreased the plaque more than a volume of 2.5%. Do you know what I'm talking about? 2.5%. There are thousands of plaques, and then you can say it's statistically significant. But if you really decide regression by the volume, I can tell you statins, anything you want therapeutically that has been followed with intravascular ultrasound and with the most recent technologies that we will discuss, the regression is very minimal. So the question that you have to ask yourself, if there is so minimal regression, what we are talking about? And this is how, as a clinician, we have to go into the events. And maybe you may change the constitution of the plaque, and you mentioned that. And this can have a great impact on events. But talking about regression, to me, is okay, but it's really not too pertinent if you are very pragmatic on the subject. Now, number 4 is interesting. You mentioned certainly the HDL. The HDL, we all talked for years about how great the reversibility of HDL is, but still we don't have any data that makes us to feel survivors of the HDL situation. And we will talk about this in a moment. And then you end up with, and everything is pertinent actually, you end up with fantastic imaging technology, which is fine to me, but if you go to the world, you're not going to put a catheter into the heart of everybody walking in the street. and that this is fine to, as a concept, that you have a tool that maybe you may understand how a plaque can change with different therapies, but certainly I feel that maybe non-invasive technology is the way to go. So I just wanted to point all these issues, because if we don't start like this can be a mix-up of a whole conversation. So these are bases to start. And now I would like to start with you, Mark Talman. And we can start actually in a very pretty, in a basic way. And at least my understanding of the disease, and you correct me, is that most of the risk factors that we talk about cause endothelial dysfunction. Lipoproteins get in, and particularly ApoB, and then for some reason the macrophage learns that something is wrong in the vessel wall, and the macrophage gets there in trying to take this, what is considered by the macrophage is an excess of cholesterol being deposited after endothelial injury. With so much going on inside the artery, the smooth muscle cells are not quiet. They try to proliferate and take over the process, develop collagen, but not necessarily have enough space to do so. So part of the problem is that there's a necrotic process going on when the smooth muscle cells don't have even a good place to survive, the space occupied by the LDL. And then when these macrophages decide that there is too much lipid material in the vessel wall and they don't do the job, they commit suicide, which is an apoptotic phenomenon. And there is a big problem. They release metalloproteinases, so they digest the tissue and contribute to the necrosis. And they release tissue factors, something that is in your heart. And you can imagine if in all of these plaque ruptures, the blood encounters tissue factor, and then the blood clots. So if I have to add something else, which we will talk later, is Pedro Moreno knows about this, is this microvasculature there, and I'm not entirely sure what their role is. I always thought microvascular tries to take the cholesterol out as the macrophages, but maybe it's not the case, or maybe something goes wrong because there is hemorrhage in these arteries. So with all of this in mind, frankly, Mark, I cannot believe there is a vaccine or some kind of something that blocks something and the disease just stops. And if you achieve that, maybe all the defense mechanisms fall apart and you may end up with an artery full of cholesterol, no vasa vasorum, no macrophages. So I'd like you to defend. I'm not trying to defend a vaccine, but I'd like to, do you think there's any defense for a molecule that can stop this huge process? Part of this is defense. By the way, the answer is no more than 2 minutes. And for you, for the others is 1 minute.
You know, I don't think there's one answer. I think that it is potential. If you really wanted to stop the process, you'd have to stop it at the earliest stage, really at the level of endothelial dysfunction before everything you described occurred. I think that what has been learned in the last 10 or so years, particularly with some of the animal models, is that the issue may not be stopping the process, but that there may be an orderly progression that can help attenuate the process, perhaps reverse the process. And really, I think what we're thinking about now is how do you allow that to progress? So the best example of this, which was what Jonathan was talking about, is that the macrophages can leave. And that what you want to do is not necessarily stop the process in an unnatural way with your vaccine, which actually may do more harm than good. But if you know that there is a way of getting the macrophages to leave, which presumably is physiologic, so the shift to dendritic cell phenotype is not just something that we created with a drug. It is something that occurs, that I think you have to look at atherosclerosis in the same way you look at most other process, as being a kinetic process of getting larger or smaller, and that what you want to do is not interfere with the process that's making it smaller, but shift the curve such that you're shifting towards an egress of macrophages and an increase in smooth muscle.
What you're saying is, first of all, you're saying something that everybody's in agreement, that inflammation is a key problem or process. And the question is, you're saying, how can you touch the inflammation enough to prevent it is too much, but not enough to affect the defense aspect?
But to do it naturally, to do it not trying to interfere with the whole program, but to take advantage of the bidirectional nature of the program.
Yeah, I hope you're talking about stopping smoking and all of that, because that's what starts the whole thing.
But that's right. If you could stop the initial endothelial dysfunction, that's something where you might be able to prevent it.
So we are not talking about molecules, we are talking about real life right now. Dr. Narula, you are there very serious, but let me ask you, when this disease starts?
Say that again?
When the disease starts?
The day the child is born.
You are really serious today.
I'm serious.
Well, it's true. In fact, the studies done in New Orleans with people who died of accidents under the age of 25, almost everybody has atherosclerotic disease. Is this not correct?
That's right. And then the recent data which is coming from Salim's group also, where they have been trying to manage the LDL levels and all, you can see the level of LDL on day 1, level of LDL at 1 year, 3 years and 5 years. You can clearly see the way it increases. And so damage starts to occur the day the child is born.
So if we want to affect the endothelium of Dr. Talman, it's better we pay attention to childhood. But Dr. Fayyad, you know there are lots of studies, which you know very well, that are pointing out that the disease starts everywhere. Not at the same time, but it's a systemic disease. Are you obsessed by the plaque, or you are obsessed now by burden of disease?
No, I think I learned from you that initially we were obsessed by the plaque, and now we are definitely focused on the burden of disease, which makes more sense, honestly.
Yeah, it's interesting that because we are dealing with a disease that is systemic, and we are dealing with a disease that starts at a relatively young age. Dr. Moreno, you like to talk about plaques that rupture and all that thing, but I like to present to you some amount of data that is very recent, actually, about 10 papers, all came this year. And I tell you the following. First, it is important to know that contrary to the common perception that there is compelling evidence that plaque rupture and thrombus formation most often do not lead to coronary events. This is what people don't talk about. In fact, there are so many plaque ruptures, which actually I could give you the figures. In a population who is at high risk and went into autopsy, actually 31% of the coronary tree had in some place or another plaque rupture. And if you have a patient with coronary arterial stenosis, despite of the absence of symptoms, plaque rupture is small, with or without thrombus formation, is in about 10 places of the coronary system. And let me continue. Only 11% of plaque ruptures are virgin in nature. That is, they really contribute to the growing of the plaque. So, with all of this, to me is overwhelming before we talk about the prospect study. And that is very rare, an acute coronary event that comes from a plaque that you say that's the plaque is going to burst.
I agree. I think the concept from the late Michael Davis back in the 1980s that the thrombosis on plaque rupture was the exception and not the rule. And I remember Roman DeSantis at the General, when I went to the first time as a fellow to go to autopsy room, he told me, you know, when you open the abdomen of this the abdominal aorta, it's like a Christmas tree. And that's true. It looked more to me like one of these double cheese pizzas. So there's no question that plaque rupture leading to coronary thrombosis is the exception. Plaque progress through plaque rupture. And the important issue here is that in the last few years, thanks to the work of Jonathan and his group and others, we have learned that if we induce resolution of inflammation, we can somehow transfer the process of progression leading into this problem that you are discussing to a unstable and actually passive plaque, which is very exciting. You know, the process of progression, we know enough. And I think the
You're getting excited, Pedro.
Yeah.
All right.
Good.
Jonathan, you talk about the prospect in 3 different occasions, and everybody talk about prospect. Probably the best trial done invasively in terms of imaging to see what happens. But I have to give you data that I think is quite important. 595 thin cap fibroatheromas were found by IVUS. 595. I have actually the data. And only there were 26 events. And from those, only half occurred in a plaque that actually was not the culprit lesion. So how in the world you are going to tell me when you have a patient in the cath lab that you are going to do something to a plaque and you are going to be right?
I think really the bottom line is that there's a lot of unanswered questions here. The data speaks for itself, but I think it also tells you that there are mechanisms that we don't know about yet and need to be uncovered. And I think that you're absolutely right pointing this out, but I think only time will tell. Maybe when we have more non-invasive molecular targeting of plaque components, maybe we will then start seeing a link between a plaque rupture and what we find on the imaging. But for right now, I think we still have a lot of questions that need to be addressed.
Mark, yes, Pedro.
Yeah, quickly, 30 seconds. Yeah, I think the prospect and the Motoyama study that Dr. Narula chaired are crucial because they taught us that only 4.6% of plaques from the prospect that had positive remodeling, plaque burden greater than 70%, MLA less than 4 millimeters square, and the thin cap fibroatheroma, phenotype by virtual histology, or the attenuated plaque, which has positive remodeling and Hounsfield units less than 30 or so, are the ones that lead to a 17% event in 3 years in the prospect and 22% ACS in the Motoyama study. But there are only 5% of 95% of all those plaques that you can identify by non-invasive or invasive will not have that problem. So this is crucial because even though the relative risk is 10, the incidence was less than 5%.
Yes, Dr. Narula.
I fully agree with what Pedro is saying, and essentially the most important thing, as you might have seen here also, the yellow studies and all, where you are showing a complete decrease all along the arterial tree here. So that is something which could be a nidus for us, that I can understand. But the whole thing, if you look at, can we really move the whole concept towards the platelets also, and that's what I was discussing with Dr. Talman earlier today. As Dr. Fuster always says, that there is a vulnerable plaque, there is a vulnerable blood, there is a vulnerable patient and a myocardium and all. Question only is that we just are going to publish one of the papers which I received from Italy, which is coming out in the March issue of JACC Imaging. There is a rupture in the artery of a patient. OCT has demonstrated there's a huge crater. Patient is on a double antiplatelet agent. They didn't do anything to that crater. They come back 6 months later. The crater is still there. Nothing has happened to that patient. He's on a double platelet and antiplatelet agents. Come back after a year and they do the coronary angiography because they are really worried. You can clearly see the crater is still there. Nothing happens to the patient here. The patient is on statins, the patient is on double antiplatelet agents. So I think we really need to look at this concept a little more crucially in terms of just simply a lipid on one side. It probably is that you have subsided the inflammation. On the other hand, you have to look at the double antiplatelet agents, and that is what probably the prospect did. And that was the reason that the prospect event rate was only about 4% a year for 3 years.
Mark, the question here is, one thing is understanding the issue we are talking about, and I think all these invasive technologies, including imaging, like the yellow study that I will ask you, Pedro, to define in a second, are important. But for the majority of clinicians sitting here, though, we need to know what we are talking about and what we are going to have an impact on the patients that come to us every day. And I think I just want to be very sure that we distinguish between these sophisticated technologies that we all use, and I'm part of it, to what is practical to the individuals.
Well, I think ultimately what's practical is the outcomes. Right? And
Thanks very much. That's great. That's what it is.
Far more than what you see in imaging. And I think the question we're asking, and so what you asked about, what do you do in the cath lab? The answer may not lie in what you do with the cath lab, but can you do something that will have an effect on the entire burden of atherosclerosis and on plaques, whether they are large, small, hopefully vulnerable, that change plaque composition throughout the coronaries, and therefore you're going to have far greater impact on outcomes than you ever will on what you see by IVUS or any other method that shows you small amounts of regression.
Thank you. Dr. Rosenson, we have a problem here. And that is, I can give you figures. The role of aspirin in the prevention of coronary artery events is 25%. Why there are 75% of the events that are not prevented? Second, on the study that we have, the PROVE study, prospect, atorvastatin, high dose, pravastatin, there are 70% of the events that happen despite of using those drugs. So what I'm really trying to get into is not just talking about the plaque, that are lots of ulcerations, you don't know which one is going to rupture, but the question is, we are dealing with a very complex field in which whatever our obsession is in one side, and I know how hot you are on the HDL business, the issue is that still we are very, very behind. So I'd like you to comment on.
Well, there's no doubt that the preventive therapies learned from the clinical trials are taking a broad population-based approach. We get statistical significance, we implement this therapy widely, but again, these populations are made up of individuals, and the risk factors may be very different in those individuals. The aspirin focusing on the platelets, but not focusing on other aspects of the, hemostatic, cascade. Clearly, LDL cholesterol lowering reduces events in a broad range of populations. In ACS population, you're getting a significant reduction of about 16% in the PROVE trial. Majority of people go on to have an event. Is this due to an issue of not aggressive enough LDL cholesterol lowering? Is it the fact that we still have excess number of LDL particles that are not captured by the LDL cholesterol mechanism? Or do we need anti-inflammatory therapies or HDL modifying therapies that may be able to complement the effects of statins on the biology of the plaque and further reduce events in ACS population?
Okay, so having said that, let's move now into a concept, and the concept may be right or wrong, but it's a concept, and that is, first we have to capture the disease soon. I think Dr. Narula expressed that, as early as we can. And how do you capture it? Well, you may say, no, I'll capture a risk factor profile. I don't want to capture the disease. Well, you may have two approaches here. One is to drastically go after the risk factors starting at a young age. And the other, you can go into imaging technology that can tell you who has the risk factors and the disease is there. And I think both approaches are justifiable. But I'd like to give you some figures which I think are very important in focusing the discussion. Now, the ideal cardiovascular health has been recently defined by 3 organizations in terms of what they call 7 behavioral factors. And they go into, from the chemical, the diabetes and LDL, into the blood pressure and the obesity, the sedentary, and the tobacco smoking, and so forth. So they go into 7. Now, you know how many people in this country know what risk factor profile they have of the 7? What would you bet? This is just published in a large population. Dr. Rosenson.
I don't know, maybe 15%, no.
Dr. Fayyad?
Yeah, almost in the teens, yeah.
Narula?
I think if we go for the all
The factors that I mentioned, they're conventional ones.
the intermediate risk would be, I mean, if you go by the Framingham risk score and equate it with the 7 risk factors here, at least 40% will be an intermediate risk.
My question is, do you know what your risk is? This is my question. My question is, we are dealing with a population here. Who do you know? Myself, what is my risk factor profile? That's my question.
I think in teens.
Pedro?
I would say less than 1%.
How much?
I would say less than 1%.
No, less than 1% is a different issue. 10%. Okay. It's 25% of people know. That is 75% of people in the world we did today in the United States don't have any idea what their risk factor profile is. I think this is a good way to start because we can talk about any molecule in the world, but the fact of the matter is this. Now comes number 2. Do you know how many people have the 7 risk factors all taken care of? Dr. Narula?
Less than 1% here.
I think is what Pedro was trying to say. So what we have is a population that is actually sick, and I don't want to go into the framing and what that means in terms of events. At 30 years, at 10 years, everybody survives, but when you go longer, so we have a huge problem. And now comes the data that was just published from NIH into what is predicted in the future. The prevalence of obesity and diabetes is going to double within the next 20 years. Second, in the United States, the cardiovascular disease prevalence was projected to increase by 10%, indirect cost by 61%, and direct cost by 200% in the next 2 decades. What it's really saying is the disease is increasing, and we are treating the disease at the very end with all these technologies and defibrillators and so forth, and the cost will be absolutely impossible. This was actually just published. And I could go on and on, but finally I want to say 50% of the coronary events happen in people that never had an event before, as you know. And then most of the people with MI die in the street before they even reach the hospital. So there's a huge problem here that I just like you guys to comment on, because this is of a tremendous degree, and that is first the lack of understanding of what your risk factor profile. Second, you have risk factors, only 1% of people or less actually are completely free. And then the disease is increasing and the cost is increasing. So I'd like to ask maybe Mark, what do you think?
So
Forget about the MCP1 now.
No.
Just get into this.
Spending most of my time now on trying to understand how we deal with the changes in healthcare and the cost of healthcare, I really think you've hit the nail on the head. We are clearly, one way or another, going to have to reduce healthcare costs. And I think the burden is going to be increasingly on us to do so at the prevention end, because that's really where you get the biggest bang for the buck. I think there are 2 things that I find frightening in general. One is that all of our studies on human atherosclerosis are occurring in a population that is healthier than the ones that are existing now, and that the enormous effect of diabetes and obesity on the next generation of atherosclerosis may actually create a disease somewhat different from what we're studying and potentially more severe, and perhaps in some ways modeling more like what happens in mice when we create a disease in a matter of weeks by making mice so sick. I think that the burden will be on us to educate our patients. I think we'll be increasingly held accountable. And as we move into a population management mode, which I think is somewhat inevitable, already happening in some states, and certainly will likely happen everywhere, it is going to be in our interest to make sure our patients are better educated early on and to intervene early on. And I would suspect that the bang for the buck will be far greater than what you get from imaging techniques. And certainly we can't afford the cost of treating increasing amounts of atherosclerosis. The country will go bankrupt.
Very well put it. Now I want to ask the same question to Dr. Narula. I think you have to leave, and then you, Jonathan. This just came out, which is interesting when we deal with risk factors, things that are new. Secondhand smoking directly caused a year ago more than 600,000 deaths, more than one half related to coronary heart disease. Smoking in humans, in women, has increased by 25% across the board. And in fact, in France, they have an epidemic of myocardial infarction in young women, which is related to smoking. So the smoking is decreasing more in men than in women, and particularly in later age, but it's increasing in young women, which is interesting. The other issue is obesity. Okay, and the data is very fascinating. They just came from Finland, and that is from an obese child, the chances that you will be an obese adult is 75%. And actually, it's not the obesity which leads to the coronary event and increase in calcification, which is what just was published. It's actually the consequences of the obesity, and that is the blood pressure, the HDL cholesterol, and the diabetes. So the obesity in itself does not appear to be the problem. So it's just the risk factors that are around them. And finally, the family history. When you look at family history of coronary artery disease under the age of 50, you realize that 75% you don't have any idea what it is, and doesn't have anything to do with the risk factors that we call hypercholesterolemia, diabetes, and all of that. So it's of a different factor. And finally, I think you mentioned from the very beginning in your discussion apolipoprotein B as being the most important of the LDL cholesterol, and I don't want to go into the CRP thing because it's really under tremendous kind of scrutiny. The CRP is adding very little to the whole story of all these risk factors that I actually mentioned. Any comments, Jonathan?
Well, I mean, I think when you think about all of these risk factors, it ultimately points to that we have two issues. One is the preventing of the disease, sort of starting at early childhood, educating, exercise, eating right. I think that's the prevention, and I think if we do it well, I think we will see the benefit. The second part, though, is how do you deal with the public that's around now that have the heavy plaque burden? Those are two issues that, although related, I think have somewhat different consequences. So I think while education, sure, even the second group, we need to educate them more to stop smoking and exercise and diet. However, they still have the heavy plaque burden, whereas the initial group, if we start early enough, maybe we could prevent the diabetes and the obesity and prevent them from ultimately getting themselves into trouble with their blood pressure, etc.
So, Dr. Narula, what he's talking about, one is promoting health, basically. He's trying to move from the very beginning. The other is to identify by imaging who is in trouble and then begin to work there. What do you think?
I think the most important thing obviously would be working on every single one to start with, and specifically those with the risk factors. I think it has to be much broader based than even with the risk factors. I think imaging is justifiable, but imaging to identify the disease, I don't think that it would become a cost-effective measure. I think our major problem is that there is a drastic dietary and behavioral modification has to occur, and I always blame the Krebs cycle. Nature made it because it wanted a pro-survival factor here, whether I will get the food today and then for next 7 days there will be food or no food. So whether you put it through the proteins or fats or carbohydrates, everything can be utilized. Proteins are more, they get converted to fat. Carbohydrate is more, gets converted into fat, but fat never converts the other way around, except the glycerol, which is only about 6%. So the problem is that whatever our blessings have been, it has become a curse in the modern day life. And unless we go radical at a much broader level, even before the risk factors have started to become prevalent, I don't think we will be able to conquer this epidemic.
So he pointed out, which is a tremendous driving force in promoting health. Now, tell us about the imaging. First of all, I must tell you, I think imaging will become very, very affordable. So the concept that imaging is going to be too expensive, I think this is like the cell phones, all of that. Everything started very expensive, but give us a sense. Certainly, calcification is a big thing. Ultrasound 3D is a big thing. Maybe MR in the superficial arteries with PET is a big thing. So give us a sense of how you see and how imaging could convert people into changing behavior.
Well, maybe I'm not sure about changing behavior. That obviously we have to see this. We have been disappointed in the past of some of the studies that tried to use an imaging-based technique to ask to change behavior. So I'm going to make a few points. One, to answer your question directly. What we are aiming to going forward, and obviously happening quite rapidly now, is the aspect of having much more precise imaging. And what I mean here, as Jonathan has said, and also Pedro, the aspect of the plaque composition itself, and going to these molecular targets to try to see this. That's number one. Number two, I think we should really also think a little bit broadly, of the integration of the different measures that we take. Either integration of imaging with biomarkers data, with genetic data, and any other markers that you can collect. And also get a little bit away from the reductionist view that we have today. We always try to figure out, I have these variables and I need to measure them to try to assess the efficacy. And I think in the future it's really going to be, this whole concept, we hear a lot about it here on campus, of big data, where you collect a lot of variables and you put them all together in some kind of complex systems analysis, and you figure out what it is, including imaging, including genetic. Because so far we've been very disappointed. Anytime we try to say, I have a marker of disease, we've been very disappointed in it. So that's how I'm trying to look at
Mark, one could say to Thahi that we all know what is wrong with us. Do you think you have to go into very sophisticated, computerized, multivariable analysis to know what you have to do with your life? Genetics and all of that. It's a point of view, but I think it's an important one to talk about.
I think it has to be driven by what you can do with the information. So I think we're in some ways saying the same thing, in that everything should first drive from the fact that if you've got the information, and let's say the information I have right now is to measure people's LDLs and HDLs and try to get the LDL as low as I can and the HDL as high as I can, and get rid of the other risk factors that are obvious. Will big data, will more information, will imaging change what I do? And I think the answer is still unclear. Where I think that big data particularly may be helpful is that as we understand people's genetic profiles, and perhaps more importantly their metabolic profiles, then it may lead us in directions that may be different from simply saying, I'm going to use this statin or I'm going to use niacin.
Yeah.
But I think, and I believe that'll be true. I think certainly, as a better example, I think at some point we'll know what are the best antihypertensive drugs to use that will work for a person's specific genotype, and won't have to guess. But it still has to be driven by the fact that if you give me the information, do I have something that I can do differently from what I'm doing now, which is to take everybody I possibly can who is high and get them to levels that I think are the ones I want to get to.
Pedro, following his approach, let me give you two completely scenarios. One, the one that didn't work. People who have coronary artery disease, there are 3 studies. One ours is going to be published in a couple of weeks with the freedom and the courage in the body. Only 20% of people reach the risk factor profile, which is perfect. And half of them leave the medications, knowing that they have coronary artery disease. So it's not a matter you go to a wall of information. You really know you have coronary disease. There is no reaction. So what can you do with that? I have presenting to you another approach, which is the approach that Bloomberg is taking. And that is to really an approach of just really getting into industry, dropping the amount of salt, the sugar kind of drinks, restaurants, what they cook, how much food they put in your table. I think there's a lot to be done in my own view. It's like the, things that are obligatory to me is the only way, in my view, that is really going to change all of this, because I don't see how we change our lives. We have coronary disease and we don't care.
I completely agree. I think adults will not change. You said that in an interview once in a newspaper. You gave up on the adults. I agree with you. The data is out there.
I didn't give up.
The data is there. I mean, what else can you ask? Freedom, courage, 20%. So on top of what you said, I will add, if I envision, 10 years from now, when we realize that we cannot pay for this super expense of health, I will add exercise as a mandatory issue for all the employers. I think 124% average reduction in events from something that is totally free. 130 minutes of moderate to intense exercise per week, that's 5 times 30 minutes, should be implemented as a mandatory issue. I don't think, on top of that, education may do something, but to avoid this financial catastrophe that at the end of the day we are all paying for, we need to be aggressive, as Bloomberg has been, and certainly go aggressively towards mandatory rules in which will lead to regression or stabilization of disease. And not only athero, because pro-inflammatory disease will give you Alzheimer, will give you CKD, will give you diabetes, all these catastrophes that these same risk factors are conglomerate into major conditions for the human being.
Robert, there is a good history. The seat belts, for example, have decreased the accidents by 50%, and so the alcohol search at night. It's amazing, the impact. So what do you think?
Well, you're talking clearly about the population-based approach, and we happen to be in a city where, Mayor Bloomberg has made some very important steps forward. We also have to realize that the food industry is doing a lot that harms us in terms of increasing the fructose in the drinks that the children get. There's the exposure of the advanced glycation end products, in butters, the air pollution. So there's a lot of environmental factors that are, contributing to the increased burden of obesity and atherosclerosis and cardiovascular events. So, that's the broad-based approach, no doubt about it. But in the first question that you asked me is about taking these broad therapies, and then you've discussed the limitations of them. This is where we actually, have to focus down on, the personalized medicine, looking at genetics, epigenetics to get better understandings, trying to help some of the people that aren't being helped with those, the aspirin, statin, ACE inhibitor approach.
Jonathan, yeah.
And I think you raised a very important point, but what's interesting is you could even take the Olympics as an example. In the Olympics, you have all these great athletes, and you don't see any American Heart Association commercial during the break saying, for the youngsters or even the older adults, go out there and move and exercise and stop smoking to just, get athletic. You'll have, Coca-Cola, for example, advertising themselves, and for people who are, maybe not as educated or will often make a poor choice. So you have to ask yourself, the Bloomberg approach is certainly one approach that may be imperative as healthcare costs go up.
What about the two aspects that I think are having? One is the polypill as a possibility for secondary prevention, and the other aspect is the complete coverage of your medicines. That is done for free. This had a significant impact even in events. So these are issues that are governmental, but at a different level, maybe.
I completely agree. I mean, I think the polypill is certainly a great concept, and we spoke about that at previous controversies, and I think your latter point is also very important, and I think additively they'll probably have a synergistic effect and hopefully reducing some of the events.
Mark, you had a comment.
I'm not sure it's going to necessarily be governmental. I think that the way we are seeing the evolution of the healthcare system, as we move into population management, the onus is very likely going to be on the healthcare delivery systems, and you already see certain large businesses that insure people at different rates based upon whether they are participating in their healthcare, whether they're involved in an exercise program and a smoking cessation program, etc. And I suspect that if there's any silver lining in what's happening is as we wind up being our own insurers and wind up taking a much greater role
responsibility
in healthcare, and essentially our depending on keeping our population as healthy as possible at as low as cost, we're going to start to take different initiatives than we've had, including how insurance rates. I think the other tool that should not be underestimated is this. And I think that a lot of institutions are really using text messaging, which is a much better way to get to people than email or phones, to actually get patients much more involved earlier on in their health care, in providing a tool that can monitor. We know that already you can monitor people's blood pressure.
It's fascinating how the Facebook and Twitter, people get hooked into it. We just came from Kenya with Rajesh, and I was absolutely impressed in a project there. The people are told how to check blood pressures with automatic machines in the neighborhoods, and then they record all these in intelligent phones, and the registry is fascinating. So in a way, what you are talking, I think, has a tremendous future. How we get hooked up into this way of communication is an enigma, but the reality is maybe is the way to go.
But it's happening, and it's happening very quickly in terms of what's available, and there are more and more companies that have sprung up specifically to how do you use text messaging and social media to get people involved in their own health care. And don't underestimate it.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that actually goes to the point of the big data. I mean, social media and all this is and finding new tools to collect and also to communicate back so you can have an impact on the patient. That's all related to this big data I mentioned. Just want to, maybe one thing that's a little bit humbling. When we talk about prevention and reversing people's habit, etc., we have against us evolution, which is very hard to reverse. I mean, seat belts, are not part of evolution. This is something, we kind of impose to protect people from, but the reversing on the aspect of prevention and human behavior is hard because of that aspect. I actually like to go back to what you started with saying, maybe inoculation, finding a vaccine, against that disease. Maybe just to close the loop again, not to say anything bad about prevention, but really I think, which would be much more efficient if you look at historically, medically, how we were able to, go against diseases. Maybe we have something against atherosclerosis vaccine-wise. So.
Now, Dr. Fuster, how do you explain in the last 10 years such a dramatic increase in diabetes, from 3, 4, 5%, now 10, 12%, and such a dramatic decrease in ST segment elevation, 25% per year from 2007 to 2012, 32% in sudden cardiac death, 28% in stroke by the American Heart Association statistics. What is going on in America for the Medicare beneficiaries?
Yeah, the sense is an interesting comment. I think the sense is the diabetes is the result of obesity, and the obesity is the result of two aspects. One is people eat cheap food and fast food, and economically is the way many people eat, and this leads to the diabetes. 80% of the adult diabetes, is in obese people. The decrease in ST elevation myocardial infarction is actually, I believe, is the tremendous consumption of aspirin, if you ask my feeling about it. I think that the people are much more prone to take these drugs. But I'd like to ask Mark, when you go over everything that evolved in the field of risk factors, there's something I would like to comment on. You have been the leader of a very important, the editor of a very important journal. You don't think that we as physicians and scientists are sometimes a bunch of idiots? We sell, no. I think what I'm saying is this tremendous, I could tell you few molecules that in the last 10 years got into the head of people. Just a molecule, when in fact a disease is so heterogeneous, like if you measure this, you're going to just get rid of the disease. And I'd like you to comment on, are these the journalists or is it the scientists? Or is it a combination of both? This is hurting because you know what is happening. Whatever the New York Times publishes tomorrow, everybody believes that. And when I go home, my wife who reads the New York Times, she tells me things I didn't have any idea. and we are in a world that I think is distorting the reality. I'd like you to, as an editor, what do you think?
Well, I think it's from three things. One is that people's the ability of things to correlate. You can almost create almost any correlation you want. And there have been some famous ones. The chances of getting atherosclerosis is greater if you speak English. It's greater if you have a PhD. And I think there is a tendency, in part because people want to come up with things that are new, want to publish, to use a computer and identify a correlation. And I would say that when we were in ATVB, we probably would see on the average maybe 60 or 70 papers a year purporting to have a new correlation, new risk factor.
A new biomarker.
New marker, and a lot of them we felt was the same thing, that we know there's inflammation. Don't be surprised if every marker of inflammation is going to be elevated. Why shouldn't they be? So we were very unimpressed when somebody came up with a new marker of inflammation, because it's an inflammatory process. But there is a tendency, partly now stimulated by our computing abilities, to find correlations and report them. We usually would not accept a new marker unless we had incredible amount of evidence, including some prospective studies, that this really is a marker of disease, and it had to be somewhat novel.
Well, this is now open for discussion. As you can see, we started with the regression of Laplace, and we ended up with Bloomberg. So, in a way, it's the way it should be. We should be very realistic here and not start talking about issues that we do not understand well, and just be very pragmatic. And we have in front of us a huge challenge here, which has been very well verbalized by all of you this evening. And I'd just like to perhaps open this for comments or questions from the group here or from the satellites.
One of the most important conferences. Can you hear me now? This is one of the more important topics that we really have addressed in a really long time, rather than just technical approaches to opening vessels. We have a global, international problem with 17 million deaths around the world. If this was war, it would be beyond belief, and we really are in some stages of war with this. We are seeing, and I do believe, despite some of the depressing data, the statistics has shown that we're seeing less deaths in the United States, certainly since the 1960s to now. We have a lot to show for it. Over 50% reduction in deaths since the 1960s cardiovascular disease, despite seeing more diabetes. There's a lot to the aspirins and statins, despite saying that there's a 70% that 70% of people who've had acute events were on statins. I certainly in my practice cannot recall the last acute myocardial infarction that I treat from a very large population. Certainly that's not statistics for population, but we can see that we're making some differences. I think we need to continue to focus on what Bloomberg is doing with reduction and the programs that started for feedings in the 1950s because people didn't have enough to eat, where our soldiers are clearly heavier than they've ever been before. And we need to focus on diet and exercise, and we all used to exercise as children. In school, we don't see any of that really to any significant degree as mandatory. But I'll say to you again, in view of all the data that we're seeing, Pedro alluded to it, how do we explain the reduction in the number of cardiac caths that are necessary, reduction in mortality? People in Europe are living to be about 82, 83 years of age. Out of the 17 million that are dying, the majority are really on the poorer nations with poorer feedings and healthcare. We are making an impact, and I think we ought to stay focused on longevity and productivity of the individual. So if we can get them to live longer, more productive, whether there is more plaque, it may be part of our natural course.
I only have one comment, and this is the paper published by Brownwell and Nabel recently in the New England Journal of Medicine. Life has been prolonged 6 years, and basically due to cardiovascular treatments. But I can tell you this is unaffordable. There's no way, all the economies know we cannot continue like this. So I think in a way it has been a tremendous advance. On the other hand, economically it's going to be very difficult to be sustainable. I mean, that's the issue. Other questions? Yes.
Well, in supporting the epidemic of obesity and the diabetes, preventive therapies really have had an impact in reducing, coronary heart disease death. So when you actually look at big population studies and map in the changes in the demographics over the decades, as has been done in the NHANES study, you can see that the reduction in events is related to the things that we can do, and we can do inexpensively, such as aspirin, generic statins, ACE inhibitors. One other thing that we need to realize is that our studies are a very limited time exposure, typically 3 years, 5 years. And the longer somebody's on a statin, as an example, the greater the benefit compared to the comparison group of either a placebo or low-dose statin. So that's another perspective that we have to keep in mind, and then also, influence adherence, which would make everything much better.
It's a good point. The length of follow-up may give us a lot of answers. Yeah, question?
Could you comment on susceptibility to risk factors? And every day it seems we see patients who may have two patients, 60-year-old men who have identical risk factor profiles. One has no plaque and the other has had bypass surgery with ostensibly the same risk factors. And this is an area that I think has been underserved.
Well, I think that's where big data and perhaps omic analysis will enlighten us. I mean, we clearly see people in both directions. People who are doing everything possibly wrong, and they're living to 95. We see people doing everything right, and they're dying in their 30s of an MI. And I think there certainly is reason to believe this is not, while the processes may be similar, it's not a single genetic disease. There are a lot of different propensities that are involved in every one of these pathways we're talking about. And right now, we don't have enough information and don't have the big data to really understand this fully. And in fact, an interesting study that was done by the first-year medical students at Stanford 2 years ago is they got their entire class genotyped, sent the results to 6 different companies, and got 6 different profiles. Some said you were at high risk for CAD, some said a low risk for CAD. But what this reflects is that right now, most of these companies are looking at a couple of markers. I think that as we get more informed about the genomics and about the metabolomics, then some of these unusual issues will become more usual. And again, I'll go back to what I said before. The question is, since that will be expensive. It'll get cheaper and cheaper, but it will be expensive. Will all this information allow us to intervene in a way differently than simply saying we're going to get everybody's LDL down to X and everybody's HDL up to Y, and we're going to try to prevent, get their weight right and exercise, etc. I think at some point the answer will be yes. That the information will tell us, first of all, who's at risk, who doesn't look like they are, and maybe give us insights on how to treat those people.
Further questions?
Actually, I have three, very quickly. One is the public health measures, as Mayor Bloomberg has put up, are very useful. The question, it's not a question, it's a comment based on prior experiences in this country, for example, with prohibition. Will we find ourselves in an interesting societal dystopic problem? I raise that as an issue merely. The second, for diabetes, I have no solution. I really may raise the problem. For diabetes, it seems to me that and obesity, it seems to me the other things we've implemented, whether it's aspirin or statins, things like that, have relatively more rapid effect than does obesity, followed by diabetes, followed by the changes. We probably have not yet reaped the whirlwind of the obesity epidemic. It's just started.
Exactly.
So that's why we have this paradox. It's not a paradox. It's just that we haven't caught the full impact of it. And the third is, now for our panelists who are scientists and I am not, do you think when it's all said and done, the events that occur will end up being stochastic, that is random? Okay, that is, there's all this plaque every place, and no matter what we do, we don't know, or we're just too stupid, and one day we will know, and they'll be deterministic. You can say, oh, the person who has this and this and this, you put them together, they're going to get it, it's going to be right over there. So, have you thoughts for the future, gentlemen?
I think while we get there, imaging will help us out for the high-risk population or the intermediate-risk population. Yeah, it is, but at least calcium scoring, it's a way to approach this dilemma that some patients with the same risk factors do have nothing, and the other ones may.
I think that we're going to learn more answers. I mean, one prime example is HDL cholesterol, which of course is used to calculate the LDL cholesterol. And people with low levels of HDL cholesterol have excess ApoB-containing lipoprotein. So is the risk the HDL cholesterol, or is it the excess HDL ApoB particles? What we've learned is that these cholesterol-loaded particles have a different proteome than the cholesterol-depleted particles, and those particles have less anti-infective, inflammatory properties than the small particles. So again, delving into HDL, we need to get past cholesterol and think about the particles, and we can learn more. So I think there's tremendous opportunity through research, to not only take the big approach and increase adherence, but focus in on where those major therapies are failing us.
I don't think.
Final comment, Jonathan. You are the final comment.
All right, thank you. I don't think we'll ever identify one specific gene or protein that will sort of be the key to eradicate this process. But I do think, at least I'm optimistic, that we are going to start finding biomarkers, at least, hopefully that we'll be able to even measure in the serum to at least further risk stratifying. And one other point about HDL, you could have two patients, as many of you know, with the same number, but one's HDL's function is completely different. And I think we as a society are so focused on numbers. We're like computers in a way. And sometimes we have to sort of step back and say, well, it's not all about numbers. It's not just, for example, the quantity, but it's also the quality.
Yeah, Mark, final.
Right, so this is not about Atherol, but I had to say this. So people said to me, why are you coming to New York just in time for potentially from Rochester, just in time for potentially the worst snowstorm? And I said, because in New York, you experience something we call snow regression.
Well, thank you. I like to... Well, thank you. First of all, thanks to the Mount Sinai Network of Excellence, all the institutions that have been really watching this. I hope they can participate more vitally in debates that will be upcoming. I'd like to give thanks also to some of the people who participated hands-on in this program today: Ricardo Samarriba, Guy Puglisi, Robert Southwork, Beth Oliver, Myra Buret, and certainly Martin Goldman, I must say, is putting a lot of effort into this, and give you thanks, Jonathan, for the effort into a very difficult subject, and of course Mark Talman for being the glue of what has been going on today here. Thank you all.